everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous book club co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's me,
and it's
Diana.
me, your friend Jacqueline Marie McDonald.
And it's me, Alan Haberman, who is not going to sing my intro.
You ruined it. I was hoping that you would too. And then I was hoping you were going to do that little hand thing that John Ralphio does in Parks and Rec, but you didn't.
No.
Well, next time.
We'll practice it.
Well, welcome, one and all, to our spring ABA Inside Track Book Club. Now, this is a special episode. If you're getting this in the year 2023, it means you are a patron subscribing at the $10 level. And if so, thank you so much. We do one of these every quarter. We get spring, summer, every season. That sounds more fun. We do one of these every season where we talk about
when
a
the wind changes.
book when the wind changes.
We feel it.
When we talk about a book and you get some CEs. If you're hearing this way in the future, 2024 or later, it means that this was released unlocked as a free episode. We hope you enjoy it as well. But you missed like 4 other book clubs. So where have you been? Come on. You got to catch up. Get to that Patreon.
People say that book clubs are their favorites. People say that.
Well, if they are not subscribed, they should say that.
Everyone's saying it.
Everybody
says that. Oh my gosh, now I don't have to read that book. So thanks, Alan and company. That's what they say.
Or maybe it makes you want to go read the book.
That's true. It could be either.
Yeah.
Yes, so this season, we were inspired to talk about skepticism in research and in data. And so we put out 3 possible books for patrons to vote on, all related to the topic of skepticism or superstitious thinking. And the winner of the poll was Calling Bullshit by Carl T. Bergstrom and Jevin D. West. The Art of Skepticism in a Data-Driven World. So we're going to be talking all about skeptical data review, of which some of this I think we found useful, some of it we found less useful, and have differing opinions as to how we felt about this book by the time we were done reading it. So we'll start real quick with the background of the authors, then we'll jump into some initial thoughts on the book, and then we'll go into some of the different chapters and kind of hit some of the big points. I think this book did lend itself pretty nicely to a chapter discussion because each chapter was slightly different in terms of what they were discussing, which is always nice. It makes it a little easier to discuss. So Carl Bergstrom is a professor of biology at the University of Washington, who, quote, this is from his UW faculty page, "I use mathematical models and computer simulations to study a wide range of problems in population biology, animal behavior, and evolutionary theory." And according to his personal webpage, he likes the idea of studying systems and communication systems, specifically right now, social media and disinformation. And if you looked up a picture, did anyone look up a picture of the authors?
No, but I usually do.
Carl Bergstrom looks kind of like if someone were pretending to be a professor and they wanted to sort of like have like, hey, look at me, I'm clearly
he looks like he
a deep-thinking
enjoys
professor.
mathematical models.
So
He does look that way.
When you wrote that, when I was looking at the notes and I read that, I was like, I wonder if Rob wrote that, like he enjoys mathematical models.
Hold it up so they can see.
Oh, yeah.
They didn't look.
Here they are. He kind of
They're
looks
in the
like...
back of the book? I didn't even see them. Oh, yeah.
I read all the way to the last page.
I love him. I love both of them, especially
He's got some
Carl.
good shots on his personal page, too, where he's sort of changing. So he's got like a cool like model professor look, but he still looks like a professor. He's a real professor vibe.
He's wearing a sweater vest for everyone in the audience. Definitely got a sweater vest vibe going. Maybe a short sleeve collared shirt.
Yeah.
I'll have to look again. He's got glasses. He's got curly hair. He's a white guy.
I would totally...
Looks like he does mathematical models.
Yeah,
he looks like the professor from Fringe.
He looks like you would hire Rick Moranis to play him.
Yes.
I also think that he is a coffee drinker and likes dark chocolate.
You think so?
Yeah.
No.
The other guy wants to get off of coffee, and he is a tea drinker now and tries to run marathons, but is not successful.
Oh, okay. That would be Jevin D. West,
Yeah.
who is at the Information School at the University of Washington. Both at the University of Washington. He studies the science of science. He's a little bit more into, I think, communication and information and learning about science, learning about the world around us. So his headshot's not as professory, but it still looks very nice. They seem great. I don't know. Maybe we'll get him on the show. I doubt it, though. So we can say whatever we want, I guess. All right. And so the whole point of this book was discussing skepticism and how data can lie to us. And I think if we do kind of let's do kind of a quick round table. I'll go first because I think I was the most positive on the book because I'm usually the most positive on the book. That's my role in the book club. And I found that this book, just from an overall narrative perspective, I appreciated how I think it started strong with sort of a discussion of what BS is. Then it had some sections on how data can kind of be used and manipulated. Then it got really boring and was talking a lot about math and had a lot of equations. And I was checking out. I was getting tired. But then they brought it back around and started talking about things that one could do in terms of looking for BS. So it felt more suddenly practical. Like they put the practical stuff. Here's what you could do now. If you remember only one thing about this book, they put that all at the end, which was great. So it sort of ended, I thought, on a strong note. Unlike many of our books, which tend to start really strong and then make the same point for the remaining 200 or so pages and then sort of end. So in terms of narrative structure of this nonfiction book, I quite enjoyed that. In terms of content, I found some of the sections looking at sort of graphical visualizations to be interesting. I thought it was a little bit more in line with what we do, although more of it had to do with sort of the aesthetics of graphs. I really enjoyed discussions of some of kind of the social media misinformation. I wish there'd been a little bit more of that.
Me too, Rob.
I thought the ending in terms of they told you what they were going to do. At the end of this book, you're going to be able to call BS in a polite enough way. And I did like the general message of the book in terms of BS not being just somebody trying to one-up you, but being pernicious in a way, and how we can support searching for information, not just calling people out so that they look stupid and then we feel better about ourselves. I thought that was a really interesting message that I was not expecting. So those are my thoughts.
I'll go next. I really loved the preface in chapter 1 because they talked about the animals and engaging in bullshit. I liked that. I also wish that they did more on social media. I found the book not as interesting as you did, but not because of the mathematical equations. I just felt like something was missing. And I'm not sure what it is. And maybe by the time we talk about it, maybe it was me. Maybe it was my headspace when I was reading it. But I did feel like it seems like there was some cultural sensitivity missing. But I'm not sure. And so I would have liked to see maybe some different voices, right? Bringing in discussions about this. And maybe I would have also liked to see, I don't know, maybe a few more examples in like real life. Maybe not like big data, right? But I don't know. But it was okay. It wasn't my favorite. I will not read it again, probably. It won't be like my go-to book when I'm bored or in the bath.
Unlike every other book club book we've done, Jackie, we just read and reread them.
But if you've not thought about this before and thinking about like how something that someone's telling you may not be true, I think this is a very interesting book. But because I'm a scientist and I also agree that science can sometimes be bullshit as well, right? Not everything is, we have to have a healthy skepticism of things. I didn't find it a particularly new information, but that might be from our background, right? But if I had never even thought about that and just trusted everything that everyone told me, this would be like mind-blowing. Mm-hmm. So that's my take.
I am pretty much in agreement with you, Jackie. I liked the idea of the book, and I can like picture these two guys like coming together, right? Like you and I do, right? Like one of them dropping by the other one's office, being like, "Oh, I thought of this for this chapter," right? And like they together would be very excited about writing this book. And I think that if you're very into this topic, you might like this book. But then the flip side of that is, if you're very into this topic, you already know everything that's in this book. And that's what I kept struggling with is, what is exactly the right reader for this book? Like, what is the demographic? Do you get assigned this when you go into a science field or statistics? Or so is it a book kind of meant for students, or is it a book meant for a lay person who just happens to want to get their world turned on its head? But like, how would that person like find this book exactly? And it's not the kind of book where you're like, oh, I just worked a long, hard day. I can't wait to get home and like cuddle up with calling BS, right? And because it reads kind of like a textbook, even though they were trying to make it read really like chummy at times. Yeah. And they threw in so many examples. There's so many real world examples, connections, graphs, stories, anecdotes. Like they did it all in the way that you're supposed to, but I still didn't feel as connected to the book as I wanted to.
Wouldn't it be funny if you gave this book to everyone for birthday presents?
Book club, ladies. We're gonna our friends can't even make it through a book that is like the lightest reading that you can imagine. So I don't think they're going to read this one.
You got 180. Got a 180. Maybe. Like, I didn't want to read A Man Called Ove, but, you know, calling BS, that was right up our alley. We had a great conversation.
But, I mean, the material that's covered in here is solid. And like you said, if I hadn't encountered this before, it might have blown my socks off.
Oh.
Let's let Alan talk.
Well, I was just going to say that they do talk about how this is sort of a repackaged version of a course they teach at a university level, and I think at an undergraduate level.
Clever, right? Man, that's what I got to do. I got to use what I'm doing in my life to write a book.
Yeah. So I think that might be where part of the like difficulty is, and like who is the audience, because like there is an audience for this, undergraduate students at the University of Washington, but them wanting to like reach a larger audience. And I think in that way, this sort of felt like Richard Dawkins for information literacy. So I could see how someone could approach this like from a like scientific skepticism, logical positivism sort of like, you know, angle of you get into sort of this reader verse and this book comes up on your suggested readings. But for that same reason, it's like not nearly as interesting a topic as evolutionary biology or as hot a topic as like religion versus science. It's information literacy. So I think that also was sort of like the topic falls a little flat compared to their like some of their rather bombastic rhetoric that they, you know, like calling bullshit or calling BS and all of that. But it's like, and here's data 5 different ways to visualize the same data. So yeah, I agree. Like, it was hard to see who the audience was. Again, information literacy is great. I just don't know, like, yes, young people maybe first entering like the university and needing to like have a healthy dose of information literacy, definitely. Potentially other people who have been exposed to, say, very narrow worldviews and are trying to break out of that. That could be. But it's really hard to say that this was a book written for a general audience.
Yeah.
Anyone could read it, but no one would probably pick it up.
I do like the cover. I mean, I like the cover and I like the title.
It's a good title.
It's catchy.
Well, and I do think that thinking about like who their audience is also, they do a lot of like, it's a book about information literacy, but it seems to presume a lot of like scientific awareness at the same time. Like they're casually talking about like, you know, high school, early collegiate, like physics and chemistry and things like that, which again, just wanting to talk about like cultural competence and who the audience might be, you might lose a lot of people in those sections who are like, well, this book doesn't feel like it's written for me.
Yes.
But maybe that's the audience.
Maybe that's what it was, Alan.
There are a lot of barriers to the people that might benefit from this information and want to access it, but because we're very, highfalutin in some of our examples, it makes it very inaccessible at the same time. It's not the most readable book at times from the perspective of someone who needs an introduction to information literacy.
I still feel like I do, to be honest.
It's good to have like a revisit and make sure we're still, because what was information literate 10 years ago, probably not the same now. We live in a much different world. So,
I mean, I did find, while there was no one chapter, maybe the last chapter, although there were components of it that I understood from other kind of conversations and how do you have a good conversation about calling BS on someone? It was probably the most like, I don't think I thought of many of these in this specific context. So while there was never one chapter that I would say, I don't kind of know this though. Like you're not telling me anything new in terms of the central thesis of the chapter. There were little bits, and I do think it is helpful to have some of those reminders, because I think one of the key components that they discuss that makes BS so challenging and so difficult is that in our modern world there is so much misinformation, disinformation, which is not exactly the same as BS, so they kind of all fall into the same category, at least by their definition, that it becomes very numbing. I mean, how many times could we be told, if it's on social media, check your ethics code, you can't just take information from what people put on there. But it's easy if that's the one time it happened that week. But when you are dealing with 50, 60, 70 news stories about some new breakthrough or new science fad or new science finding, it is exhausting to figure out which ones are real, which ones are BS. And they'll even tell you kind of at the end of the book, you're not going to be able to look up every, Facebook shared article of like, look, this article, which was in the Atlantic, therefore, that's a good paper on, there was something I looked today, even Apple News was like on ice cream, and scientists don't want you to know about ice cream. And I tried to click on it to see, is this a good example of BS? But I couldn't even find the primary source. And then it was behind a paywall. And I was just frustrated and tired after maybe 4 clicks. If I were doing that all the time on every single piece of information that's thrown my way, that I may suddenly then throw out because someone's mentioning something they saw somewhere else, there's just too many cues, I think, that cue up conversations about BS that we see online, that it's hard not to be constantly talking about it, even if you don't want to. And it's impossible to keep up with fact checking it. And it just becomes exhausting to the point that I sometimes have to remind myself to do the same thing for things related to my own job, in which I could harm someone if I take BS at face value and I don't do my due diligence. And I want to save my good skepticism for things that really matter to me. And sometimes it's nice to see some of the tips they gave, including the one of, you might just need to start teaching yourself, I don't need to pay attention to a lot of stuff that's being thrown in my face all the time, because it will make it harder for me to remain skeptical, because you just get tired of it. You just become exhausted and numb to how much information is out there, what words get used all the time until they have no meaning anymore. So, those components I found to be most helpful, to me in terms of this as sort of a lifelong skill. But again, I agree with you all that, yeah, I'm not quite sure. I went into this specifically for a very specific, like, I want to get better at skepticism, and we're recording a discussion about this book. If you're not in that exact component, you're either going to know more than is in this book, or you're not going to know enough, I think, to be able to really meaningfully stick with all aspects of this book, because I think some chapters are much more accessible than other chapters. I can see a lot of people getting to the chapters on mathiness and equations and probabilities and just saying, no, I think that I'm good. I think I get it. there's a lot of BS out there, and then not getting to those last chapters, which I think are very important.
Yeah.
You're probably better off reading the last 2 chapters of this book if you're not going to read if you can't read the whole thing. Read those last 2 chapters.
I actually agree with you.
Actually agree with
No, I mean, like, those last 2 chapters were good. Even though the book wasn't like my most favorite of all time, I did appreciate those last 2 chapters, and I do love a nice roundup.
Mm-hmm.
Or wrap up. Roundup.
I almost didn't make it to the end of this book,
Same.
to be honest.
#same.
Because I got bogged down in the chapters 3 and 4, even though they had a lot of really beautiful, BS graphs to look at. There were lots of pictures to look at, right? But even though
on the duck architecture.
The duck architecture? Oh no, I don't.
I forget it was that chapter. It's the idea of things looking good, that not having any function.
The chapter called data visualization.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say that I would recommend that. That might be a good chapter for like other behavior analysts or people in our field who do use visual analysis rather than statistical analysis. Just because I feel like that chapter, maybe 6 and 8 as well, just because they talk about like selection bias and how that can affect graphing. Those would be really good recommendations. But yeah, chapter 7, data visualization, just what a good graph is and what a fluff graph is. Be very important.
Yeah. But it was long, and it included a lot of examples. And maybe we're going to talk chapter by chapter, Rob, so I don't want to get into it too much. But then the end of the book, the last 2 chapters, they stuck so much good new information in there that it really kind of brought it back around to me. But I almost didn't make it through the quagmire that was the middle of the book.
Isn't it funny when they do that at the last 2 chapters? They're like, there's so much. Oh no, I've like waffled around with my words for the first couple of chapters, and now this is what I actually mean to say.
Yeah.
It's like
the first couple, you mean the first 9.
Yeah.
It wasn't that waffly.
It's so professory, right? Like, let me tell you everything, and then I'll get to the good points, like right at the end before the bell rings in high school. I say by the bell.
Let me click through the last 25 slides here.
Holy moly. Here's the point.
10 minutes.
So, yeah, I guess if you're like, I don't want to listen to anyone talk about this book anymore, I'll go pick it up and read the last 2 chapters. You know what? Might not be the worst thing to do. Although you pay for the whole book. You paid for the whole book, but you only need the last 2 chapters.
No, I like the first 2. I like the preface in chapter 1, too. So,
all right, so you need 4 chapters of this book. And then at that point, you might as well just finish it.
I found that so fascinating. So can we move on to chapter 1 so I can talk about how fascinating I thought it was?
Let's go into it. So again, if you haven't, if you're sort of coming to this book new, or you haven't read it yourself, some of our sort of sum ups, you don't quite get the context. Basically, the idea of this book is that while BS and chapter 1 goes into it a little bit more detail, used to be sort of the realm of the snake oil salesman, of I'm just going to use fancy words that don't mean anything to try to convince you that what I am telling you or selling you is important. We don't live in an era where that works quite as well, though it still could work some. We live in an era where it's very easy to sell your BS using math and science, or what looks like math and science, which is a lot harder for the average person to necessarily understand when they are being taken for a ride, because it is very easy to camouflage your BS with terms or graphs that look very fancy. Or you say, well, it's part of an algorithm. It's like, well, I don't know anything about computer science. So if it's an algorithm, it probably is true. And giving people, the goal, giving people the power and the literacy to understand that they can identify what's BS, even if they don't have a background in math or science or computer science or technology. And yeah, so that's kind of the beginning of the book, the preface of the book. So we get to chapter 1 about bullshit everywhere.
It's
and
like my
a lot
favorite.
of animal examples.
I love
you love
the
that animal examples.
So this is what I was like, oh, this is going to be a good book. When I read this chapter, I was like, I am jazzed, because they pull it back. They're like, this isn't just a human problem. This is like an everyone problem. Like, ravens will like put things down and pretend to hide their food so that other ravens. So it's like a biological, characteristic that could come into like evolution. And I loved that. And I really appreciated, I'm going to jump to the end of chapter 1 where they're like, it's really easy to create BS, but it's really hard to get rid of it. And I love that they tied that back to the autism vaccine, right? And I was like, ooh, look at you, right? So, because that's a great example that it's been very difficult to clean that up, right? So it was really, I don't think it was easy for him to make that study, but it was definitely easier for him to make that study falsified than it is for us to debunk an already debunked study, right? From like, I don't even know how many years ago, but I just like the timeline and the progression of that first chapter because it gives us, I think anyway, for me, it pulled me in and I was like, oh, okay, I kind of see where I'm going. And then I love that take home point that it's like, it's so easy to make, but really hard to clean up. And look how, and here's a perfect example of that, where if you're reading this book, you probably don't think vaccine causes autism, right? Because it's a scientific book. And I appreciated that kind of take home.
You're speaking of the Brandolini principle.
Brandolini!
They quote on page 11, I took this quote because I like this. The amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than that needed to produce it.
Oh, there's another quote too. I'm trying to find it right now.
Is it the Jonathan Swift quote?
Yes. Do you have it written down
Falsehood
too?
flies and truth comes limping after it.
Yes, I love that.
I knew you'd like that quote, Diana, versus the order of magnitude one.
Or I had highlighted on the same page if you combine the three, you learn 1, BS takes less work to create than to clean up, takes less intelligence to create than to clean up, and spreads faster than efforts to clean it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when we sort of skipped through some of the animal piece, but I like the evolutionary biology of BS as but like Jack, you have the example of the ravens and how this could have developed in terms of producing BS requires some amount of theory of mind. If you don't understand that people have different perspectives than you don't engage in any sort of a lying behavior. So I think they listed it: ravens, chimps, and gorillas are the only creatures that can BS. But it's not the same.
I've been watching all the crows in our neighborhood now.
Do the crows do it too? What's that? What's the family that crows are in?
Corvids.
Thank you, Alan. I said it knowing you would totally know the answer.
Well, and just even step back and they talk about the mantis shrimp that will still do the aggressive display to threaten potential predators, even if it's in the process of molting. It's just like, well, like the mantis shrimp probably doesn't understand that it's lying. It's just engaging in the same behavior that it would as if it weren't vulnerable, because evolutionarily doing that has protected it. So they haven't had to come up with a new behavior of hiding. And I sort of, but then they sort of then jump to the crows and be like, well, it seems like the crows understand that they're lying, but maybe they just have a rule that says you only really hide food when another crow isn't, or a raven isn't around, and that we probably don't actually know. They could just have a sophisticated set of rules that they learn either genetically or potentially socially about you act one way and a discrimination training kind of thing. So, which I, again, feel very comfortable because we're behaviorists, right? We're yeah, we get this. We get this. This is making sense.
Yeah. I also appreciated how this chapter really differentiated lying from BS, because I think most of us, when we think of BS, we think, well, that's lying behavior. But they're really under the control of a lot of different variables. And for the most part, we try to avoid lying because if you could just lie, you'd be like, look at this new invention. It's the best invention. It will cure all the problems. And people would buy it, and then they'd say, hey, that didn't work, and we'd all shrug. But we don't lie directly because there are a lot of social penalties and punishers for people who engage in lying behavior. Whereas if you engage in BS behavior, well, there's a chance no one ever knows that you are stretching the truth, or you are using statistics to say something that doesn't mean anything. It only works because it has this like deniability behind it. Well, like, oh no, the thing I said, I think they use an example later on, like, no, this is a 99% caffeine-free cocoa is one of the examples. And then they use kind of the percentages to talk about how much caffeine is in coffee. Buddy, the door's closed. You can't come in.
Yes. The answer is yes.
How, technically Starbucks coffee is 99% caffeine free in terms of it is not, 99% of caffeine, because there's so many ways you could use that term and still make it mean something. So BS is not a lying behavior in that you have this plausible deniability behind it. You're using words either out of context or using numbers out of context. And it was just words. It seemed easier to figure out that it didn't mean anything. Because if I said, oh, this is, dentists prefer this one to the other brand, it's like, do they really? But when you add in that 9 out of 10 dentists agree, it's like, oh, well, that's a fact. That's a statistic. 9 out of 10, that's the thing to buy. Because that one dentist is probably wrong. The 9 must be smart, even though that doesn't mean anything. Did they literally ask 10 dentists about this new toothbrush? I mean, where did they get that information? So when we come down to it, BS is a behavior, or BSing is a behavior that might have some sort of kind of, evolutionary background perhaps, but it's verbal behavior that we engage in. It is not the same as lying. And it allows for presenting information in a way that possibly avoids other social punishers that come from lying, but still takes advantage of other people in some way, sometimes not even purposefully.
And they just barely address it, but one other thing at the end of the chapter, they talk about that we live in like an information landscape right now that makes it very hard for truth tellers to sort of stay on top of the cleanup, because we've gone in less than a century from like the radio being our sole source of radio and newspapers to like Facebook. The like balkanization of social media over the last 4 years has, made that worse. So there's that's an important point that they sort of weave throughout, but like this chapter is where they sort of say it most clearly, that it is a very hard time to be trying to do this work, which is why they probably are wanting to do it right now.
That's true.
Well,
do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
Hey everybody, hope you're enjoying our book club so far. I want to remind all of our listeners that if you're listening to this when originally posted in 2023, you're listening to this through your Patreon feed, don't forget to click the link in your show notes to go to the original posting where you are going to find a special secret code word. In addition to our typical secret code words, the special secret code word is going to give you 100% off when you purchase CEs for this episode. So if you are a patron at the $10 and up level, thank you so much. And as part of that thank you, you get the third bonus code word, which you can put in at checkout to get 2 CEs for no additional charge as a thank you for subscribing to the show. If you're listening to this in the far future and you're not subscribed on the Patreon, well, you certainly could go to patreon.com/ABA Inside Track and join up at the $10 level to get access to that code word, or you can just get CEs as you normally do, like if you would rather. Whatever works for you. We're all about choice and options here. Either way, no matter the choice you make, you're going to need to have the 2 regular code words. I'm going to give you the first one right now. It is dash, D-A-S-H. It's not that spice. Well, you know what? It could be that spice. It could be the kid from The Incredibles, but it is actually the name of Jackie's new puppy. I'm sure there will be pictures on social media at some point. Dash. All right, let's get back to the rest of our conversation on calling bullshit. That actually comes up and is one of the main thrusts of Chapter 2 about media, message, and misinformation. And they start with a quote, or it's near the beginning, there's a quote by sociologist Neil Postman. I looked up a few of their quotes because there was suddenly a moment while I was reading this book thinking, is this book all BS? And at the end, they're like, gotcha. You read a whole book thinking that these were facts. This was all a bunch of malarkey and we got you. It? Now we taught you a lesson. Don't believe anything ever. Which wouldn't have been that great a lesson. I just would have been left angry at the book, I suppose. So I did look up some of the people they were quoting and the sociologists. And at least the ones I looked up are real people who did things related to...
Isn't that the name of the postman on Seinfeld?
What? Neil Postman?
Neil?
I don't think so. No, it's Newman.
Oh, Newman. Okay.
I had to say it with a Newman. But Neil Postman, sociologist, not mailman, said, the invention of new and various kinds of communication has given a voice and an audience to many people whose opinions would otherwise not be solicited and who, in fact, have little else but verbal excrement to contribute to public issues. And reading that, you might think, this sounds like a sociologist talking about social media and how everyone has a voice and how there's some pros there. A lot of the cons are you can spread any information you want to. But no, he was actually talking about television way back in the, I think the 50s or 60s or so. So this is not a new problem. The idea that new technology allows for the potential spreading of information.
They said they're worried about it with the printing press.
Yes.
Right? Now just anyone can get their book printed.
They go over to Gutenberg and say, print this. 9 out of 10 people in Venice agree.
Well, and specifically that they thought that the brothel of the printing press is the metaphor that the book producer of the time was worried about. Maybe his own job security, but no. He's worried about the moral fabric of society being underdone by affordable books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
May have ulterior motives, maybe.
Yeah. And we've taken that to its sort of natural conclusion now, where anyone can go on a worldwide platform and post almost anything they want to say. And if people want to hear it, they can find that information or opinion.
And we can do it from our car and from our basement or our bedrooms and
truth.
Sure can.
Oh yeah.
And we do.
Anonymously.
Yes.
Or under fake names.
Yes. And while there are pros, and I do want us to address the pros of this sort of more liberation of being able to share information and share voice, because there are many in that we hear more stories from marginalized groups. Yes. We hear more stories from communities that traditionally have not been able to share their worldview or their opinions. And we are able to sort of share, just even if it's not, helpful information, information about our favorite hobbies. We're able to make social connections in ways that we could not have made 20 years ago when, you potentially live somewhere where no one shares the same interests as you, and it limits your ability to have meaningful friendships. So there are a lot of pros to this process. But the cons, cannot be ignored in that anyone can publish information, like you were saying, Diana. And it also really changes where are the incentives for speaking out. And I did like sort of in this section the idea of but people used to be able to make up stuff in, say, a newspaper. But it seemed like there were more checks and balances even with some of those publications. And they weren't perfect. But the idea that I'm going to write a headline, with the word nude or violent. What's that from? Newsies, I think, where the best headlines that sell the papers. Remember Newsies, everybody?
Corpse.
Yeah. Christian Bale, but the best headlines have words like
I was thinking about this too.
And murder in them, right? If it bleeds, it leads kind of stuff.
Right.
But
he said, huge fire on Ellis Island, thousands flee in panic, giant conflagration. Yeah. A dumpster fire with seagulls? Okay.
But once you bought the paper with the headline, the other headlines in the paper weren't trying to take your attention away from the rest of the articles in the paper. They just needed you to get the paper, and then the rest of the headlines could be more docile. They could be more factual. But when we're talking about the internet, every single click is its own headline. So every page has an incentive for you to click more. That's where they get their money. And every page is sort of its separate entity. So they need to keep you engaged. They need to keep you clicking. They need to keep you looking at their, here's the secret that casino owners don't want you to know kind of stuff. So
house always wins.
Yeah. So when it comes down to it, some of those checks of like, I just need you to get the paper, then we can be factual. It's like, well, you don't have to be factual about anything on the internet, because at the end of the day, they got your clicks from paying attention to it. I remember I was on a hike with my family, which I should have been mindful and paying attention to the hike. But I clicked on one of those links of man makes a necklace for his girlfriend and like what was inside it. And I was so like, oh, it's going to be gross. It's going to be like a tooth and then they had like generic pictures of, it's a necklace and it's a thing. And every page, it was like reading old newspaper funnies where it's like the first panel is like, what was Popeye doing yesterday in the funny, and then something, and then it just repeats itself. So every paragraph, every click was like a new part of the story. And then he made the necklace. It's going into all this detail. And I'm just clicking, and I realize about 30 clicks in, this is going to be the stupidest ending ever. This is irrelevant to what I'm doing in my life. But I have to keep clicking to sort of see what happens. What if it is something really exciting? And all it was the guy put his engagement ring in a necklace he gave to his girlfriend. But I spent like 30 minutes clicking on this BS.
I do that.
They got me.
I do those when they're like, look at how different their hair is. And it like goes through like all of the year. I'm like, let me see. Alan's shaking his head.
Because you commiserate with us on these stories, Alan?
Or he's moved on.
Because it's amazing what 10 years generationally can do. I would never read one of those articles. I would avoid them like the plague.
That was the one I read. I was just curious.
Robin never does this stuff.
No.
That's how badly he didn't want to interact with his family on this hike.
No, it was like this necklace and it had like a shell in it. I was like,
oh my God, Rob.
Every story like that, I'm like, there's going to be some gross, mushrooms in it or bugs crawling in it, or this guy did something really, like, I thought it was going to be like an episode of Hannibal.
So why did you subject yourself to that?
Because I wanted to see the twist ending where it was terrifying and it was just, and he proposed to his girlfriend.
Did you cry?
No, I was pissed off.
He actually sat down in the middle of the woods, Diana, and started crying. Just like I got mad when the hair was the exact same 20 years later.
Wow. You got really good cell service in this forest.
It was a good wood. It was a good cell tower nearby in the wood.
I was going to say, just to sort of lasso us back to some resemblance of a point on this. You were talking about how the globalization and sort of open platform that we have helps a lot of marginalized groups or people that wouldn't otherwise have access to platforms be heard. I think that's another area that, like Jackie was talking about, it felt like they needed to explore that a bit more.
Yeah.
And specifically, I think what they don't do in this book is talk about how the tools of information literacy are being turned against like marginalized groups and being like, well, we're not producing misinformation, you're producing misinformation, when it's very overt that it's self-interested people who are, generating like fake news, quote unquote, are saying, well, no, like we're telling the truth. You're the ones who obviously are like, being salacious and over the top. And I actually was just reading sort of something similar about this performative rationality of like, well, if I seem calm and you're emotional, then I can say anything and anyone will believe me, especially if I'm using this like facade of information literacy, and you're very passionate and being honest and truthful, but I can get people to not believe you. And I wish that and this is not a new idea, and this book is from 2020, and this was already a problem, so I do wish they had spent more time in some chapter talking a lot about that, about how what you have to now watch out for is people taking information literacy and using it to undermine legitimate information. So
no, I hear you, Alan. They could have beefed that point up. They do. I mean, they do bring up some well, I know they mentioned it somewhere in here, but it's not a big point. The idea of, you know, like who's gaining from misinformation. But you're right. That is a left out component, and it does sort of make the assumption once you have these tools, you'll be ready for the fight against BS. Whereas you will probably be more ready, but that doesn't mean. And they do bring this fact up. It doesn't mean that someone will just come along and say, aha, now that we know this technology, let's co-opt that for a new brand of BS. And you'll need, you know, calling bullshit 2, you know, 5 years from now to be like, okay, remember those? These rules don't apply anymore because everyone learned them. Now these are the new rules because people will always try to, and I don't want to say lie because it's not quite the same thing, but they will always try to spread this kind of mis or disinformation in the form of BS. So it's going to be a moving target. And I think it's going to move faster and faster and faster because of the technologies available. Some of which are, you know, probably moving faster because of the use of those technologies to create such polarization in such a rapid pace that probably wouldn't have occurred without, well, it might have, but it probably wouldn't have occurred as quickly.
And they did say, they're like, it's going to be harder and harder to tell what is deep fake videos and pictures and things like that. So they noted it, but they didn't touch on it a lot. And I thought that too. I was like, this would go, I almost feel like maybe this would be a good preceding book to read before you then look at street data, right? Because street data then goes further into how we can maybe better collect data in a way that's meaningful, not just statistically so.
Contextual. There's a more contextual piece.
That would be
the
the
data.
one
Yeah, sometimes you sort of want to say the only data I care about is the data that I can see in front of me, and if I can't, and it's not in a published journal, even then it's a little suspect, but less so. I don't want to engage with it. Which, I mean, one of the reasons I don't engage. That one guy in his stupid ring. I don't go on any of those websites anymore now. It ruined me.
Usually those break before you get to the end of the story.
So, like you were saying, Diana, as technology gets better, it's going to be harder and harder to keep up. And the authors say, so that's why we made this book, pretty much. Because while we could count on our government to do something for us, do we really trust the government to be the ones to decide what is and is not BS? Which I think, Alan, that might actually be the only time they really make even close to the point you were just making. And you made it a lot better in less words. Congrats. So that's good. And you could use technology, but then that just gets co-opted into the next form of BS. So what if we just educate people on media literacy and critical thinking, which again is a good goal. I think this book does I think it does a pretty nice job with it, but again, it's not complete. There are other pieces to it. It leaves out part of the narrative that is not maybe directly related to just the basics of spotting this information. But that is the reason this book is here, because they can't count on anyone but yourself, is what the authors are saying. Which brings us to chapter 3, the nature of BS, which goes into kind of a definition. I'll give the definition that they give on page 40 in the book. Bullshit involved language, statistical figures, data graphics, and other forms of presentation intended to persuade or impress an audience by distracting, overwhelming, or intimidating them with a blatant disregard for truth, logical coherence, or what information is actually being conveyed. So, in terms of this book, I think the definitions of BS they often use, or the examples, I should say, of BS they use, sort of hit various segments or quadrants of that definition. Some of the examples they give really focus more on the lack of logical coherence. Some are a little bit more on the idea that they're conveying information, but it's not clear what information is being conveyed. And I think sometimes the examples aren't as clear that there is that blatant disregard for truth versus just poor design decisions, which I think also makes BS harder and harder in the modern era, because there are more and more, mistakes made that aren't necessarily meant to be purposeful. They're just bad design for the goal of getting your eyes on whatever they're trying to show, even though they might not be actively trying to lie to you about what they're showing. They just don't care if it sends the same message that everyone's going to get. They just care that you pay attention to it. And I think one of the parts that they feel is a little different about their book is that they refer to the black box effect. So this idea that a lot of the data that people are using these days, especially if we're talking about, big data, are algorithms. It's math, it's computers. And most of us don't have the background to be able to effectively understand whether that algorithm's any good or not. But maybe we don't need to, as I'll talk about in some of the later chapters. Maybe it is more just about the process. What is it we're looking for? We're looking for the data. Where's the data coming from? We're looking at the results. Do they make any sense? Are they plausible? How strongly is the author telling me that this is the way things are based on the data versus this is a finding I had. It could mean a number of things, right? Which is usually what, say, when we're reading science papers or peer-reviewed papers, usually there's that. We think it's this, but it could be a lot of other hypotheses that might explain what's going on here, which would probably be less likely to be BS paper than one that tells you this is what's happening here. And that, yeah.
I was just going to bring it. This reminded me just how recently it's been coming out. I think in the last year, it was realized that the tau proteins involved in Alzheimer's research, that basically that data that has informed this, Alzheimer's research for over a decade was basically faked, and it was reproduced in quality journals. I think originally was even printed in Nature.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's obviously overt, dishonesty. But if quality publications are susceptible to overt dishonesty, then what hope do we have that, or how much BS makes its way through because it's better presented?
Yeah,
there
was some statistic. I think it was there was some study in 2018, which could be BS.
You don't trust that statistic?
That I don't know. It says that 2.6% of news is fake news. Is somehow
that seems low.
Generated. Seems low. Again. But then again, U.S. news articles are false. It was a 2018 study that they cited in the book. Again, maybe there are reasons that study is not quite telling you the same thing that it sounds like, but that is just something that was mentioned in the book, that there's going to be a lot of falsity or BS in really anything.
Right, and I think that us as a field in ABA, we're talking a lot about replication and how we need to be doing more of that because, if we don't use statistical significance as robustly because human sciences struggle with that. Mm-hmm. And so, again, very relevant to us as a field to know that there are limits to even the most quality versions of journals. But again, they give very more mainstream examples, but just thinking about how I felt like those examples would have fallen into this chapter exactly, about just how no quality resource is free from potential misinformation, disinformation, fake news, that kind of thing. Yeah. So
when we have BS, we have all these tools being used to persuade, to impress, to confuse, overwhelm, all those terms, and it's impossible to check every source. So the rest of the book pretty much goes over, up to the last couple chapters, pretty much goes over. These are sort of the key areas you're going to want to be looking at. So chapter 4 talks about, I think this is a good one to discuss because kind of like you were saying, Alan, in terms of looking at even smaller publications, I think our field is small. We use so much single subject research. We're using observable data. You sort of get the sense of we probably aren't as susceptible to BS as some of the other science fields that are just looking at huge numbers and they can hack their p-values as much as they want to. But at the same time, I think we still can make mistakes, which is not the same as BS. But we also can fall into the trap of some of the things happening in this study. I know sometimes even reading papers, and I don't know if it's meant to be BS or whether it's be jumping the gun, but the idea of what's causality, what's correlation, and what's just a simple what's just a simple association. I think it's very easy to make a paper. These were the findings. And then just by choosing your words carefully, make it seem and that was because, this happened because of that. Yeah. This is a causal effect rather than, I don't know, it's an association. And you can show experimental control and still not have causation. it's experimental control. They're not exactly the same thing, but it's easy to forget that because you read a paper, you're like, I want to learn something from this paper. And the narrative is much easier to understand when it is, we did this, we put this treatment in place, we saw this behavior occur, therefore this treatment makes this behavior happen, rather than was associated with that change. Experimentally, it's unlikely that a lot of other things would have changed. But you're not going to write that story in your PowerPoint presentation. You're going to just say, because this, that, which is not exactly the same thing. And then later chapters get into sort of how the game of telephone can sort of be played and turn something that actually is real good science into BS pretty easily, based on who's delivering the message.
I liked just to go back a tiny bit, I liked the black box analogy. And I think that if you're reading this as a behavior analyst, it's a useful one because we already use that type of metaphor, or we don't, I guess. We're familiar with that type of metaphor. And so it kind of comes up again and again. So they present the idea of like what the data are that are being gathered, or, is the thing that's going in. And then our extrapolation and interpretation of those data on the other side are what's coming out. So that's like your output or your behavior, so to speak, if you were to like do the analogy. But then what's happening in the middle is really hard for us to understand, either because it can't be seen, or it really is only understood by folks who understand statistics. And that leaves out a large percentage of the population. Later on, they're going to tell us some ways around that issue related to the black box, but I just wanted to bring it up now because I think it does have some nice parallels for folks. And then the other thing I think for us as behavior analysts to think about with this book is not, I know that it shouldn't be a shock to anyone to think about skepticism as related to science, because that is part of our training. We learn to, expect and look for the most parsimonious answer, etc. But I think that a good lesson for us here, too, is not to solely rely on our skepticism, right? And not to immediately go there, because that can create other issues as well. So we should, whenever we hear percentages and stats coming our way, we shouldn't automatically discount them, but we should, it's like a scientific problem in and of itself, right? Trying to figure out, are these statistics, correlations, or causations that are being presented to me, should I be accepting them on face value? And if not, what are all the variables that are coming into play here to produce this, supposed outcome? And how can I scientifically evaluate and suss out what's really happening? Versus just, rejecting it outright because it's new information to you. Sorry, those are just the things I wanted to say.
Why didn't you say them when we were talking about that section?
Because I just thought of them.
Okay.
Diana, you know what I love about that is that you teach our students that. You have a whole part of lecture where we talk about the black box analogy.
Right.
That's what I was thinking of when you said that.
All right. Sorry. I guess I'm slow on the uptake, but we already knew that. Proceed.
Well, I'll just add, Diane, just because your point made me think of, I think we're sort of seeing that within the field, and sort of like what Pat Fryman talks about, of like behavior analysts always being on each other's side. I don't think he means being like an unskeptical cheerleader.
Yeah.
But I think he's saying that skepticism is good, but like we have a common framework that we should be working from first, and then applying the skepticism like second, rather than just being ungenerous to each other. And so that just made me think of like this sort of the inverse corollary between this book and what Fryman is that you got to find the right balance between skepticism and just blindly accepting of, well, behavior, this is in Java, this is great, right? Like, I'm never going to question this.
I love that too.
Yeah. I was thinking black box. Do you know of any behavior analysts, either in publication or in talking, that ever sort of try to use, private events or sort of the internal biological mechanisms as sort of a black box to take advantage?
Well, that's methodological behaviorism.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rob.
So we don't do that because we're radical behavior.
No, I know we wouldn't do. I'm just saying, does that ever come up as like a mediating factor of like, we did this and there's these things inside that happened and you don't have to know about that, but therefore these results.
I think that's what we're trying to work against.
Yes, I would think so.
I'm not going to call anyone out for having
you're like, hey,
mentalistic explanations in their data.
That's the fun of it, though, Dinah. You got to subscribe if you want to hear us talking trash about you, right?
No, thank you.
One thing I love when we talk about correlation versus causation is the hilarious examples that you can get from correlational research that people say that are causation, right? My favorite one is that organic produce causes autism because both of them are on an increasing trend.
Yeah?
You didn't like the decreasing birth rates and decreasing pairs of brooding storks in West Germany?
Well, I mean, that could...
Well, and there's great internet resources where you can basically take two graphs and show like either a correlation or an inverse correlation about two unrelated things because the data matches up so nicely that you can really pick two random data sets and weave together some narrative that like this is related to this just because the data like all fit together nicely. But then, like in the book, the example of how we go from casual, semi-scientific observations of beer consumption of college students to people in news outlets calling for the banning of pitchers of beer being served because it makes people drink more. It's like, no, like people who, exactly that graph, people who buy pitchers want to drink more. And when we want to drink more, we tend to drink more. So if you're buying a pitcher of beer rather than a glass, you're probably intending to drink more. So like there's no magic. The causation is I wanted to drink more.
Yeah.
Not that it was served in a pitcher.
Yeah. And then even if as a researcher you are very careful with your wording, you're not using wording choices that sort of have that I think they even mentioned what is the grammatical syntax you want to use if you want to imply a causation, even if without, I didn't say it was caused by this, but there's sort of some syntax you can use to make it sound like causation without actually saying it's causation. You still then get to deal with the fact that people are going to take your story, take your research. If you're lucky, they're going to care about your research enough to then publish the news article, which then gets smushed into the, social media share article. And you just have this sort of echo chamber where your article, no matter how well you phrased everything, becomes causation, whether you wanted it to or not. There was, what was it? They did an example from like Zillow actually had done a good report in which they just described a correlation between housing prices and birth rates. I think that as housing prices were going up, birth rates were going down. I think it was and again, not to imply that because of the raise in prices, people aren't having babies until much later, which could be, but they weren't saying that was the case because they don't know. They just have these two sets of data going in these directions. But then the headlines were all about, rising. That's what it was. Rising house prices cause parents to delay having kids. So that's a fact. That's really happening now.
That's so true.
And there was a quote, which I told my kids, they did not find it funny, but perhaps everyone else will like the quote. That was, correlation doesn't imply causation, but apparently it doesn't sell newspapers either.
Wah, wah, wah.
I thought it was good. I like that. And again, one of the key things, if you ever hear someone in the news saying, what were we talking about, Diana, the other day? The studies on alcohol, on how the studies used to be like, alcohol, a glass of wine, it's good for you. A glass of beer is good for you. Now it's, if you drink, now it's like, if you drink it all, you're going to die sooner. And how all of these, all these prescriptive statements are based on studies that if you probably read the study aren't that clear, or they'll be like, well, this is a change in percentage, but they're not asking questions about, but what would the change in percentage be in a different, in a similar but slightly different situation? How many people actually have some of these same problems? They bring up one of the studies related to alcohol later in the book, but really there are a lot of factors that have to go in. So if you ever read something that says, this study says this, assume it's BS. Maybe it's not, but assume it's BS. Don't listen to it. Don't change your lifestyle because an article citing something that was citing something else that cited a paper that probably wasn't prescribing a change in your whole lifestyle. Just don't don't buy into it.
Yeah, I don't know enough about that alcohol research to know what may or may not be true at this point. So I don't want to.
But we're not saying anything about the study because we did not read the study.
Yes.
But we are saying the articles that were published to describe the study and that would have prescriptive statements about how this is not good for you or that is good for you. It's almost automatic BS in the sense of it probably is not telling you exactly what was in the original research. All right. Are we ready to move into chapter 5 where everyone started losing steam on this book? Numbers and nonsense.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, this is the chapter where I lost steam.
It was a lot of
and
percentages.
Stopped reading this book for
a lot of formula.
6 weeks.
Yeah, you did. I powered through. I mean, the key component in this chapter really had to do with the idea that there are contexts to numbers, and that most of the time when people see numbers, they assume, well, numbers are numbers. You can't change numbers. They exist or they don't exist. But how a lot of the data that are presented do have a context to them. And it might not be a context that the researchers are going to talk about because it's not relevant to what they're trying to explain or their audience. But as these things get reported or as you are reading critically, you do want to take into account that there are lots of different values. Sometimes scientists make mistakes even with numbers. Sometimes people are trying to BS you and they're choosing the numbers that sell what it is they're trying to sell. And there's a lot of math in it. So if you don't like reading lots and lots of math, it's very confusing and it's easier to probably be like, I guess they know what they're talking about.
Math.
I found the example. I was talking earlier about 99.9% caffeine-free cocoa as a selling point, which just reminds me of Mad.
That's what it was.
It reminds me of Mad Men.
Coffee, cocoa.
Ever remember the show Mad Men?
Yeah.
Where what were they talking? Oh, they're about like cigarettes and how they wanted to. Everyone was worried because the studies about how cigarettes will kill you were coming out, and Don Draper, the main character, says, "We're just going to say our tobacco is oak toasted." Which doesn't mean anything because all the tobacco is oak toasted.
Right.
But if you talk about its oak toastedness, you're not saying causes cancer. So you could just say anything with numbers. You could say two times more oak toasted.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? How is it 2 times more oak toasted? You don't usually think of these things. You just see it and it's got the big like comic book POW graphic behind it, and you say, well, that must mean something. They wouldn't advertise it if it weren't important to me.
And improved.
Yeah.
Right. Or when they call it like family size and they're like, it's 5 times more than what?
Then
right?
what?
I love that. 5 times more. Get it for yourself.
And you assume it's, the original like Snickers when it wasn't family size. But you'd have to actually look at get a Snickers bar and compare it, right?
Man,
I have always been skeptical because I feel like I have been aware of a lot of these types of advertising tricks for a long time. So my parents must have pointed them all out to me when I was a child, is my guess.
I can tell you that I was not. I was beautifully gullible my whole life.
It was twice as delicious, therefore you got to buy that. That's the one to buy.
Yeah, it's like improved ingredients. I'm like, I am in. And it even happens sometimes late at night now. Like, they're like, if you do this wild contraption, you will feel 100 times better. I'm like, bot. So, just so you know, I own
100 times is a lot. I mean, if it's got a percentage, especially if it's like now 33% more, it's like, well, they wouldn't say 30. Like, that's a pointless. A 33 is not that exciting. If they're lying, they'd say 100%. 33%, that's probably science.
Isn't that funny, though?
But still,
I love that.
it's like something that's 33% more is only 25% bigger.
Mm-hmm. Well, you don't even know what the more is. Is it 33% more than the leading brand? Is that the weight? Is it nougat content?
You're right. It could be, yes.
Is it percentage of carcinogenic dyes? Like, we don't know what it is.
Is it just the size of the packaging and then everything else is the same?
Usually it's yeah, it's like compared to 9-ounce bottle, 12-ounce bottle is 33% more.
Mm-hmm.
But it's only 25% bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you use math that way, I like that they describe that can both be BS and true at the same time.
This may not be an important feature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's like marketing BS. I think, they do go into more scientific BS. So talking and sort of political science BS, I think a little bit more targeted here. The idea, kind of like you were saying, Dana, that percentages, if you look at percentages, like a percentage increase followed by a percentage decrease does not equal the same number. Like it went up by 10%, then it dropped by 10%. Whew, okay, good. So it's exactly where it was. No, it's different.
That's right. That's why you got to pay attention to the way in which your clearance percentages are going to stack on top of one another, so you know what it's actually going to cost you.
Yeah. But if you want to make it something seem huge, don't use percents. Use real numbers, because real numbers are always really huge. But again, if you're using real numbers, it's very easy to ignore other factors related to sort of like, is this worldwide numbers? Is this based, what is this based on? Where's the sample from? Is there a selection bias being used here? So it's not like if you use percentages, you're probably lying. If you use real numbers, you're not lying, or vice versa, because there's a context.
Well, but even then, if you use real numbers, if you use big numbers, there comes a point where like the difference in a million and a billion
is nothing.
Is 1,000-fold. But if you ask people what's the difference between 1,000 and a million and a million and a billion, they'd be like, the difference in 1,000 and a million is bigger. It's like, no, like they're.
Well, you know what? My head just blew up. So you just saying that just blew up my head. So
these are weird concepts.
Can I just tell you guys?
They make sense, but they're still, when you hear them, you're like, I don't think. It's like when you look at the arrows, which they talk about in the book, the idea, like which arrow is longer, and even depending on sort of your cultural background, you're going to answer that question about the arrows that they're 2 inches long, like fact, 2 inches. But depending on where you grew up, I think it's like Western civilization, you say, no, these don't look the same. But if you live in a different part of the country, you're like, no, those are exactly the same. So it's those small things that they make sense. However, that doesn't mean that they come naturally in terms of your understanding of those concepts.
I was just going to say that there used to be a show that came on PBS called Square One. It was a math show. Did you guys all watch Square One?
Yes.
And there's one, it was like a skit show, but it was about math. And it was actually pretty good, as I recall. But there was a Peabody Award, perhaps? Skit where it was like a game show, and they asked that question of what is the proportion of 1,000 to a million and a million to a billion, and they had a song that said 1,000 times 1 million, that's 1 billion.
Oh, you sang that song.
I know, I do. That's how I remember that particular fact.
Does it make
Thank God for Square One. That's probably what saved me.
Now you can see BS wherever you go.
I watched it too, but it didn't save me. So
Square One. Remember at the beginning they had that skeleton that was attached to the exercise bike?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So glad you saved that.
Really taking me back.
So again,
I'm just gonna go watch Square One.
You're just gonna watch Square One on YouTube now.
See y'all.
So I mean, that point about the 1,000-fold. So just basic facts are hard to understand. Then when you add in the fact that people can easily just change a few numbers or change a denominator or change a numerator and then make a statement that is totally true, but is still BS because of how they're presenting the information. I think they give the example of, the number of, the number of incarcerated African Americans in the U.S. They looked at the percentage of African Americans in the U.S. compared to a total prison population, and it was reported that there was a decline. Which you read that, you're like, oh, that's good, because I think there's a lot of issues with our prison system, and it's good that number is declining. But then if you look at the actual numbers, you see that there was the percentage change had to do with the fact that the number of white inmates also increased by a greater amount. So it wasn't really that there were less incarcerated African Americans in U.S. prisons so much as there just were more people altogether who had been incarcerated in prison. But percentage-wise, the percentage did change, but it doesn't really mean anything because it's all more people in prison, which I think we all would like to not see.
Yeah, you're not getting the full picture.
So it's very easy to just change things around, or depending on which number you report, you're telling a story. So that context is going to be so important. And then there's one here for all you publication professors. Goodhart's law, they mention here. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So as more and more colleges are looking for how do we make it look like our college is very smart? Well, publications are important. When you start measuring how many citations do your publications get, it changes the utility of that measure, because there's a lot of ways to get things published and to change the number of citations that go out that might not be. So the number goes up, but that doesn't actually mean quality has changed. Teaching to the test would be another example of that Goodhart's law. Oh, and then they talk about mathiness, which they brought me back a little bit for mathiness. That idea of what if I took something that actually has scientific value, like the periodic table, and I just put like my BS buzzwords in the periodic table, and everyone will see that and say, oh, it's the periodic table of Marvel Comics characters. This must be very important to know that the Hulk has a Marvel atomic number of 1. He must be the most important Marvel character, as opposed to I just took the periodic table because everyone knows the periodic table, and it is a very elegant design, and I just threw a bunch of crap in there. Doesn't make it meaningful, whatever I put in that periodic table.
Are we on the part about like the diagram of the unicorn?
That is, I believe that's a different chapter. That's coming up, though.
Let's get there.
You want to get there?
Mm-hmm.
All right. That's enough mathiness?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Math.
Do we want to talk chapter 6 selection bias, or we kind of did that a little bit?
I think we did that.
I think we did that well enough.
We
All
did
right.
that. Let's move on.
Yeah, it's the next chapter. Data
Visualization. Okay, this is where I really came back
It's
in.
a ram.
There's a unicorn in there.
There's also a unicorn.
Oh no, data visualization. That's where the periodic table came in. Actually, I jumped ahead already because the periodic table is data visualization. So this is lots of graphs.
There's a ram in this chapter too, Rob. There's a ram and a unicorn.
Yeah. They're all in this chapter.
Found them both.
So we all know that graphs are important and graphs should tell a story. But what if my story was BS? Could I use my graph then? Yes. Yes, you could. Should you know? Could you? Oh, yeah, totally. The chapter we'll get to the unicorn in a second. I want to start. The chapter does start with a graph showing the results of the stand your ground laws, which are those laws that if someone pulls a weapon or attacks you, you should stand your ground and shoot them with your own gun. And they had a graph to demonstrate. Look at the number of deaths since the law went into place. And if you look at the graph is decreasing. It's a decreasing trend, which makes everyone think, well, I guess those stand your ground laws actually cut down the number of gun violence deaths. But then you realize, if you look closely enough, the y-axis has been inverted because, as the creator of the graph said, I prefer to show deaths in negative terms.
Sneaky.
So this wasn't even a graph in which like gun lobbyists made up a graph so that it looked like stand your ground laws were effective and caused fewer deaths, even though they were causing more deaths. This was a graph creator who had an opinion of the world that they put on their graph that told the exact opposite story that the data were supposed to be telling. So that's not even, I don't even know if that qualifies as a BS graph, just in the fact that it wasn't meant to confuse anybody. It just wasn't well made, which is another problem. Is sometimes it's not BS, sometimes it's just bad design. And this chapter kind of goes back and forth between bad design versus BS.
And sometimes people not understanding their own data.
Yeah.
Which is a concern.
So there's a nice section on where graphs came from. And I never really thought about it. I've just used graphs for so much of my adult life. The idea that graphs were not something most people had any idea what they were until they started being used in papers, and it was like basic bar graphs in like the 20th century. And then it really wasn't until like the 90s that people started using graphs and graphical visualizations of data like all the time across all areas of our lives.
Did you not have in school the whole story about how Florence Nightingale invented the pie chart?
No.
Did you not have that? Yeah.
Is that real?
Like that was one of those oversimplifications that happened, at least for my generation, about how she invented it to show like proportionality of deaths and just relevant because she was talking about like correlation versus causation and all that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So I was surprised that they didn't address that because maybe it's not widely known in the upper echelons that connection has been made for younger generations.
No, Florence Nightingale did not make it into the book.
I I've never heard that.
No. I gotta look that up now. But in any case, graphs can be hard to read if you do not have training in them. I think they cite, there was a Pew Research Center study they cite in which half of Americans can correctly interpret simple scatter plot graph with a college education. If you do not have a college education, that statistic drops. So even, some of the kind of more basic graphs can be hard to understand, just if they were created very effectively, very well, without trying to obfuscate data. But there's a lot of fun ways that you can obfuscate data. And let's get into things like the unicorn. So this is the duck design, which we mentioned kind of at the beginning of the episode. So the idea of a graphical duck is it's an architectural term where you've got a building that just has a lot of great ornamentations that is completely irrelevant to the point of the building. And it came from this old farm building in New York that just looked like a duck, even though the fact that the building was shaped like a duck was irrelevant in terms of like being a better place to sell ducks or
it didn't just
to
look like a
store
duck,
things.
like they designed it to look like a duck.
Yes, it looked like a duck. That's what I mean.
Not just like on accident. Oh, that cloud looks like a duck.
No, it specifically was meant to look like a duck.
Building look like a giant duck.
Yes. And USA Today decided, what if our graphs were all duck graphs? What if all of our graphs looked like something else? And so they'll have all these different graphs. Like, it's an ice cream scoop, and the ice cream is a pie chart of popular ice cream brands. Or here's an example of a lady exercising, and the different parts of the lady's body are the trends in exercise. And how, while there's nothing necessarily bad about doing this, like it's kind of a fun way to show data, it also doesn't add anything to the data, and it can make it impossible to actually read the graph, like what the graph is showing. They have a great example of tines on a fork that are supposed to sort of be like popular, like quick service brands or something.
Yeah.
And you try to read the graph, and it's like, what if I read a graph at a 45-degree angle and with tons of words and weird fork tines and little, like you wouldn't make a graph that way if you actually wanted anyone to understand what the graph is telling you.
At least with these, the percentages that are being represented are accurate, I think, as far as I can tell. They look pretty much accurate in these designs, and then some of the later ones, that even goes out the window.
Yeah.
So they're trying here. There's just a lot going on.
But it would still fall under BS in the sense that they are trying to like send an odd message. They're not trying to they're trying to kind of obfuscate or hide what their main point is. Like they're just making something that's hard to understand.
It's hard to understand. Yeah.
It's not bad. That's why BS is not lying. Like they're not trying to tell you false information.
This graph also says Rubio's is the most popular sit-down restaurant. I never even heard of Rubio's. What's that?
When you look at that graph, I had to look very closely and read the percentages to find out that Rubio's was only slightly higher percentage popularity than Burger King, because the graphs are at the other end of each other on these fork tines. And if you have to read the percentage to read the graph, Hardee's? Harvey's, I don't know.
Oh, I've been to a Harvey's.
This must be like regional.
But Taco Bell. Us. No, Taco Bell is the highest I had at 19%.
The longest tine is
the only
Taco
reason
Bell
I would
tine.
know that is because I saw the percentage. And as we all know about graphs, if you have to see the values of the data points, you didn't need to make a graph.
Might as well made a table, I guess.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
Well, and my question was, why isn't McDonald's on this chart?
I don't know. I wondered that too.
Ronald did not pay up USA Today.
Info.
Right? I mean, it's not, but it is.
Right. It would be number one, I would think.
It's better than Burger King. Ugh.
Jackie loves Burger King.
I don't know why.
I do love Burger King because I used to be a food and crew safety manager there. But now I've changed because I can't eat anything at Burger King anymore. So now my favorite is Wendy's because I can get a hot potato, a plain hot potato from Wendy's. So Wendy's is now my favorite.
All right, Dinah, let's get to your favorite, the goat. And what was the fun name for the goat?
I'm looking.
Was it the glass slipper?
It's a labeled schematic.
A labeled schematic.
It's under the glass slipper and ugly stepsisters section.
So the glass slipper graph is the idea of what if I took my data and I put it into a prettier visualization that displays other types of data. which loses the thread of why would you put it this way? So do you want to describe this?
So it's as though the different parts of this unicorn here represent different business. No, I don't even know. Sorry, let me see.
Well, the horn is creativity.
It's related to a business analytics award program, and so the different parts of the unicorn, one part is creativity, one part is statistics, one part is business acumen, one part is analytical thinking, but they all correspond to different like size parts of the unicorn. Creativity is very small. Something called big data and Hadoop is the middle of the unicorn, but there's no way to know.
I love its tail. Business acumen.
What these things necessarily represent, or how they were decided to map onto the unicorn.
If somebody gave this to me in their thesis. If someone gave this to me as their thesis, I would not be pleased. Just going to put that out there.
Yeah. And then the one below that is even worse in my mind because
I hate that one.
It's a pencil, so it's but it has little areas like blocked off on the pencil. So the eraser is said to represent business development, and it even has like a bracket to make it look as though that's like a certain like percentage. And then the little like metal part that connects the eraser to the rest of the pencil is administrative. And then the entire length of the pencil is called management creative production. And then the very tip of the pencil is called happiness.
The graphite.
So, like, what is this?
But not the wood. That's
the wood is...
Personal interest is the wood part of the pencil.
So then, in whatever this is representing, happiness is only 5%, presumably, of whatever it is. But why would... We can't even measure these things against one another, right? So, like, what is a percentage of administrative versus a percentage of happiness? That we don't even know what that means. So these are not even, proportionally representative in the same way that the tines on the fork graph was.
Yeah.
And it makes it so that it's really uninterpretable.
Yeah. Oh, labeled schematics.
Yes.
Oh, you said that already. Sorry. But that was near the glass slipper. Yeah. And again, that idea of what if I just used a visual and I put a bunch of buzzwords on it? What does that mean? And again, it's probably meant to be harmless. Like, well, what a bunch of boring information I have to share. But if I put it on a unicorn, everyone's going to have a great time. But you lose the point of why would you have a good visual that is well labeled if it has nothing to do with the data or the concept you are trying to explain? Like, if it doesn't make the information easier to understand, it is irrelevant.
All right. So I got a kick out of those.
Yeah. They did have a section in here on how to make a bad line graph, which...
I also just liked all the bad Venn diagrams that aren't actually Venn diagrams. That was... Yeah. That was great. So basically, it just takes me back to the idea of like the like teachers, administrators, parents, and it'd be three gears that all interlocked. But if you actually know mechanical engineering, if you have three gears that interlock, they don't work. Right? The whole system jams. So again, it's useless schematics. Mm-hmm. And I was really disappointed they didn't have that gear example in this book because it just bad graphics are bad and need to be avoided.
I think the example, what did they have? They had one with, it was like they were trying to do proportionality, but it kind of looked like a Venn diagram. And I think it was supposed to be about marijuana use. And if you look at it as a Venn diagram, then the intersection of like marijuana use and never abused marijuana actually went together. So it makes this sort of, there's no way that could be. Like, how could they be in the circle for marijuana use and not marijuana use? Oh, here's the product excellence, promotional focus, and effective branding. And in the middle, they make profit, which, again, is...
Underpants, profit.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought these up, because I love a cleverly designed Venn diagram, but these are not. These are not that.
No. So if you're going to use visuals...
I found the marijuana one. Yes, there's overlap between... smokers and non-smokers that they have drawn it.
But again, I think the circles are supposed to be, look at this is the bigger circle. But if you're going to use big circles, don't have them intersect to make what looks like a Venn diagram, because people have seen those. It muddies your message, or that was the point, is to muddy your message.
All right, let's bring it home.
You guys want to talk about 3D graphs?
Bringing them home.
3D graphs?
No.
Don't use 3D graphs, folks. It's terrible. All right.
Or donut bar charts.
Yep.
No donut bar charts.
The donut bar chart was very eye-opening to me because I hadn't thought about what they had to say about it. That the one on the outside is way longer. So that was a good lesson to me, actually.
All right. Chapter 8, really quickly, calling bullshit on big data. I love that this was just like anecdote the chapter, and I think the idea gets at, hey, guess what? All these smart people are making all these fancy, like I think we were at the Babbitt Social, and Chat GPT came up a whole bunch of times, and our friend and colleague was talking about sort of Chat GPT. With some former guests, a lot of former guests speaking at the Babbitt Social this year to our show, and a lot of discussion of technology and AI, and that idea of AI is not just what if human brain but faster. It is machine learning is not learning because it is doing what we think it is. It is just like multiple exemplar training. We're just throwing what we think are relevant exemplars into an algorithm and then hoping it picks up on a pattern that's really important. But a lot of times that data set will pick up something we didn't understand. Like, will my data understand who will not be a criminal? And when you realize, well, they just dumped in a bunch of pictures of people who weren't smiling because they used pictures of the criminals and of course, what pictures did we have of the criminals? The ones where they probably were getting arrested or arraigned and they weren't smiling. So they taught the machine criminals are people who don't smile. Non-criminals do smile based on a bad data set. Or Jackie, did you like the one about the wolves? How do I tell the difference between a wolf and a Siberian husky?
I did like
There's
that.
snow in the picture.
I also wanted to bring back about the one with the smiling and the point that if the criminals are smiling, then they're not just criminals, but they're psychopaths.
We don't know that for sure.
No, but that's what when you go deeper into that, that's what people will assume.
Well, but they chose biased pictures became the problem because you have to get a set of pictures. So they choose pictures of criminals to say, look, machine, these are criminals. And then they get pictures of people who aren't criminals. These aren't criminals. But where do you get pictures of criminals? Probably from some sort of an official government document where you're not smiling because you got arrested. Not your happiest time.
I have a criminal scrapbook, so if you ever need pictures of criminals, just ask me because I just love criminal I love scrapbooking. No, I don't. But if I did, it would be a criminal scrapbook.
Of criminals? That's good. So again, machine learning, and anyone who talks about algorithms and big data, where are you getting your data? You don't need to know anything about computer science. You just need to say, where is your data coming from? And that's going to tell you a lot about whether the data coming out is garbage too. Because again, algorithms are created by people, so there is going to be a bias, and machine learning plans can fail. What was the other? Oh, Google Flu project. What words can Google search for, and that'll tell where the flu is going to be. But over time, they just had so much data, probably because they let everyone know, look, you can search Google to figure out where the flu is going to be, that all of a sudden the algorithm started thinking words like high school basketball. People searching for high school basketball implied that there'd be a flu outbreak in that area, as opposed to maybe it's because flus and high school basketball events tend to occur in the wintertime. So it's very easy to have really good intentions and think you're very, very smart and not understand why your algorithm is giving fake data. So I kind of thought of it as it's the worst. It's potentially the worst multiple exemplar training. What if you did multiple exemplar training and you picked something, and instead of things that were kind of commonly understood exemplars that you're going to see in real life, you gave it to someone who had no context of what the world actually is like? Would your multiple exemplar training be successful? Who knows? So I'm going to say BS on most machine learning to some extent. I'm not that skeptical of it. You just need to be aware that you don't understand why the computer is doing what it's doing. But if they're picking bad data, it's going to be a bad algorithm. All right, Chapter 9, science, peer-reviewed science is under the heat lamp. What's not the heat lamp? I'm thinking of Burger King. What's under the microscope?
Under the microscope?
Under the grilled.
Sharp. You know what? Flame broiled. Those are
hungry.
flame broiled burgers there, Jackie. 100% more flame broiled than the leading competitor. Anyone have any? I mean, I thought this chapter was probably one where most of us, looking at so much peer-reviewed content, probably got the least out of it. But was there anything that that jumped
I'm glad
out?
they included it here. They talked about publication bias. They talked about that most researchers are not, even though they have good intentions, they're not solely in it. What was the term? Epistemologically pure.
Yeah.
Epistemologically.
Yeah, because, you have a job and you need to, publish things and, get some credit for doing that. So there's always that motivational piece in the background too. And they started to kind of get into the morass that is scientific publishing, but that could have been a book on its own. So I'm glad that it made its way in here, because sometimes people think, oh, it's, any published research study should be put on a pedestal and held to this high degree. And there's no possible way it could have any fallacies or misinformation in it because it's been published and it's been peer reviewed, but there's vastly different qualities that can be on the output side. And so you should approach those with skepticism as well. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad it made its way in the book. Chapter 10 is next.
Oh, I was going to say, I appreciate a review of the null hypothesis. I always sort of start to mix it up and just get to the point of like, yeah, p-value. If it's less than 0.5, that's great. As opposed to actually thinking, well, what does that really mean? We're testing against a null hypothesis. This is the percentage chance that that the results we got would have happened by chance versus because of something I did. It's a very small difference between the two things. And it's very easy to say, yeah, I see a number lower than P, then P is less than 0.05. Great. These results are true. There's no other explanation. This is a fact. Causation, right? It's easy to make those jumps without necessarily meaning to. It's just you read a lot of statistics. They're very boring.
Yeah, it's true. They had some scary statistics in here about the likelihood of getting false positives and false negatives, and that it's much higher to get a false positive than you might actually think based on the statistics, and if you don't have a solid understanding of them. And many of us in our field, that's really not our background. So it did give me pause, and I will look at those more carefully in the future.
Yeah, a couple of rules they had there that were good were the idea that even in research, it's important to look back at anything that everyone says. Everyone says this. Everyone says this is a fact. Everyone says. Sometimes you want to double check those. There was an example I was trying to think of throughout the book, and then they finally mentioned it in this chapter, which was the idea that opioids are not addictive, which was a very highly stated and cited fact, quote unquote fact, for years and years, especially around sort of the rise of OxyContin, that like, no. There was a study in Nature or the New England Journal of Medicine saying that opioids are not addictive. And then it was impossible to find the citation. And when it was finally found, it was from like a note or a letter to the editor, I think. It was just something very small where it was just some little note saying like, in this small study, it didn't seem to be an effect. But because it was in a journal, it was able to be cited and then recited and recited. And once you cite it enough times, it becomes an important fact from an important journal rather than something someone said once and that we all decided we all forgot where we heard it. But it sounded good at the time. It made the case. So even in really popular and important journals, I think, Alan, you brought up an example earlier, citation in Nature. It's very easy to have something get blown out of proportion, even in research papers. So any science paper can be wrong. If it's a really big finding in a really big paper, it's probably okay. If it's a really big finding in a really obscure paper, it's probably BS. If it's a finding in a paper that someone paid to have in that paper, probably BS. And
I think that goes in to chapter 10 really well. The rules for spotting BS.
Yeah. Let's go over what rules. What were your favorite rules for spotting BS? Which again, I love that they. I think we talked about how we did how they came back, and if you're only going to read 2 chapters, you could read chapter 10, chapter 11, and actually have a pretty good idea of how you can spot BS and how you can call BS.
My favorite was use reverse image lookup.
That's a good one.
I don't usually do that.
No, I never have.
I need to utilize that.
I mean, I've already said mine. The think in orders of magnitude.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that one. I love that one too, Alan. Yeah.
Mine is if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. Because can I just tell you that is the one I fall for all the time.
Yeah.
So that one I need to be. I have to be mindful. I'm and people will I have some friends that will text me and be like, look, if I buy this thing that's like a headstand thing that puts you in a headstand and holds you there, you'll no longer get headaches. I'm going to buy it. It's on Facebook. Do you think I should buy it? And I'm like, no. Because if it no longer gave you headaches, then why isn't a doctor prescribing it? So no, right? So that one.
Too cutting edge, Jackie. The doctors haven't heard of it yet. That's why.
Yeah, so that one is really for me because I frequently fall prey to that sort of thing.
Yeah. I think the one that I like the most was just questioning the source of information, because I love questioning sources of information, because, it's always like, who's telling me this? What do they have to gain by telling me this? How do they know this? Are they trying to sell me something, right? Those are questions that I just naturally tend to go to. But I think the one I probably most benefit from thinking about in terms of getting better at my skeptical thinking would be the thinking about unfair comparisons. Because when I see comparisons to things, I tend to just be like, well, one number is bigger, so that means something, as opposed to these are two bigger numbers. Well, why is this one big? Are there reasons other than we measured the exact same thing and one number was bigger that these results came about? And the example they have is they talk about murder rates in cities and how it's really easy to make murder rates in cities make certain cities look terrible and other cities look really good. But when you look at what's actually being compared, it's not comparing urban center to urban center. In some places, it's urban center plus all the metropolitan areas. So, of course, the murder rate might be higher in that area because it is a larger area. So it's not a comparable statistic in that regard.
The city limits for some cities are much smaller than others, depending on, I guess, when they were founded, maybe. And so.
Yeah, but that's what I never think of. I just see numbers and I say, oh, those two numbers.
Yeah, I would not have thought of that.
So I want to get better at the comparison. What are we comparing?
Well, and that in the refuting BS chapter, they talk about redrawing your figures, and they, especially the Apple cumulative sales, and it just gets bigger and bigger, right? It's because it's cumulative. It will never get smaller. It will never show a decrease because it's cumulative.
And I was aren't they just showing that everyone has to buy a new phone every 2 years because they designed them to break?
Right. Well, and again, it's cumulative. So, it's only going to show an increase. So then you need context of, what is each quarterly, what does this data, how much is it increasing by? And you can be like, oh, there's a big dip. I think that's important for us as a field because we do use cumulative records sometimes for certain skills. And then we maybe need more context for talking about something. So, I just like that example.
Yeah. Then there's another quote that I like that went with their tip about avoiding confirmation biases. And it's Neil Postman, who's a sociologist.
We know.
Quote, oh, sorry. Oh, yeah, we talked about him at the beginning. I don't know all my sociologists super well. But at any given time, the chief source of bullshit with which you have to contend is yourself. And I think that it's a good rule of thumb. I'm very skeptical of, who's trying to sell me something? I'm less skeptical of, why do I want to believe this as being the skepticism? Why is this important that this is the truth versus another fact that might have a different hypothesis other than the one that the author is telling me or the author is hinting at might be causation when really all we have is an association or correlation. So kind of check yourself before you wreck yourself when it comes to BS, perhaps.
You're hilarious.
Thank you. I try so hard. And then finally, after we have that great chapter with some tips to practice by, because again, the other thing is this isn't I read the book and now I'm great at spotting BS. It is a lifelong skill, and the skills that you learn for the next 5 years will probably not help you 5 years after that when all of the technology changes and you have to relearn some of these lessons. Some of them will be true forever, but not all of them. I'm sure reverse lookup will be less and less relevant as deepfake technology gets better and better, and as there are just too many places to search to try to find a citation of where the original image came from.
Maybe it'll get better too.
You hope so. It's possible.
We're all doomed.
One thing in this section I thought they did a good job of is the psychology of debunking.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, make what you're doing palatable so that you win over people, not alienate them.
Yes.
I think that's an important thing that people don't, like, this should have been in like super bold, needs to be made clear, because it's something that we struggle with societally right now, is lots of finger pointing and being like, well, you're awful. Now, some people are awful, and we should call out people who are being awful, but it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Some people could just be, I think maybe you're mistaken, and let's talk about this if we can.
I couldn't tell if they were trying to be a little tongue-in-cheek or a little silly with this last chapter on refuting BS, just because of just the way they're describing it. Is it calling because I just thought it was just like a fun term, but like, no, like, we're dead serious. The whole point of the book was about calling BS. So that's why we have this chapter. And the idea of calling someone's BS as a performative utterance was the term they used.
The chapter's called Refuting.
It's refuting,
BS.
yes, refuting BS. But it pretty much was just the fancy way to say calling BS, because that's what this was all about.
Do you know what they should do, Rob? What I think they should do is, then the last chapter, they should just reference the book, How to Have Difficult Conversations. And that's what they really should do. They should just be like, if you haven't read this other book, read this other book, and you can use that other book to call out bullshit from your colleagues and your friends and your family. Love this other people. Because I thought I actually got way more out of How to Have Difficult Conversations than I did in this chapter, and I think there's some overlap.
Jay, do you mean Crucial Conversations?
Oh, yeah, that's what I meant.
I was like, is there a different book called How to Have Difficult Conversations? You're thinking How to Win Friends and Influence People, perhaps?
No, there is another one that I read at work that's similar to that one.
Okay.
But all of those books. Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want to say what these 5 tips are?
For refudiating?
Debunking myths. Talking to people.
Sure, I'll list them real quick.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I wasn't sure. I thought you were saying
it's be correct, which means make sure that you've double-checked your facts. Be charitable, which is, keep your friends and your colleagues, but focus your refutation on the argument and not the person. Admit fault. Be humble. You can make mistakes. So if you come from a place of humility, you're more likely to be effective in debunking bad information. Be clear, which is just be very poignant in what you're saying, which sort of gets in to the be pertinent, but basically be very focused on what you're doing and don't be unnecessarily complex. And then yes, be pertinent, which is be on point with what you're talking about. Don't get off into the weeds about the myth, their intention. There's all sorts of different things you can do to really muddy debunking. So avoid the pitfalls as much as you can.
While I think it was a bit off topic, I don't know if you like this part, Diana. When like Alan, you were saying, be pertinent. They went on a real long tangent about the difference between being pertinent and being the actually guy, and they had a whole section about how can you tell if you're actually calling BS or you're just the actually guy in a conversation.
Well, I just have to say there's a game show that I like called Actually, which is all about doing that in a tongue-in-cheek way. So I found that kind of funny.
Oh, good. Okay, you like that too. I thought it felt a little like you're watering down your last point, but it was sort of fun to talk about the idea of, if you're actuallying, you're actually making more BS than you are actually calling out BS, because you're not doing it to sort of help anybody so much as make yourself look smarter, and you don't have any reason to do it other than you want to do it. which is a little different than the motivations behind BS. So that was a fun little end section. And then we get to the wrap up of the book, which is my favorite section because I feel even nonfiction books have to have good conclusions as well. And I thought this book ended very well. I liked its last quote, and I liked sort of the theme of the last page. And it sort of came back around to the idea of calling BS not being about you, but about helping other people. That's what, calling BS is about. It's about making the people around you smarter, that you have your own biases, that you need to be responding and talking about data with your own humility, and you need to keep reflecting on what is truth. Why is my truth different than someone else's truth? And am I doing something wrong, or is there a mistake? And we should always be doing our best thinking and trying to be more trustworthy in our information. And then we have our final quote on the last page. Calling bullshit, quote, is a moral imperative. Some of it is innocuous, some is a minor annoyance, and some is even funny. But a lot of the bullshit out there has serious consequences for human health and prosperity, the integrity of science, and democratic decision-making. We all have to be a little more vigilant, a little more thoughtful, a little more careful when sharing information, and every once in a while, we need to call bullshit when we see it. Which I thought was a very good ending.
I need to be truthful with you guys.
Mm.
The skeleton that was attached to the bicycle, that was 321 Contact, which came on right before Square One.
Yeah, you know what? I was like, I don't remember that, but I might be wrong.
Yeah.
I appreciate you called yourself on your own bullshit, Diana. Thank you for modeling for the audience. Or did you actually yourself?
I probably actually myself. All right.
Woo!
Yeah.
All right, final thoughts. I think we kind of did some of the final thoughts at the beginning of the show, but it's been a long time. If people want to say them again succinctly, maybe Jackie, let's start with you. I think you had the most sort of didn't like, but you weren't quite sure why it was, and we've been talking about the book for a long time now. Did anything else kind of snap into place, or are you sort of still in the same position you were when we started our conversation?
No, I'm still in the same position.
Okay.
I would have loved to hear a little bit more roundedness from potentially different viewpoints and how bullshit may affect different cultures and different communities, because I think we get the perspective of this one community, right? But like Alan said, we're not all members of that one community. And I do like their succinct nature at the end. I still love the beginning, but yeah, nothing really changed for me.
Mm-hmm.
But as behavior analysts, I think a lot of the times we can get sucked into the BS. We can get sucked in, unfortunately, right, due to lack of time and lack of resources and lack of supervision. And so I think it's especially important for us as behavior analysts to recognize what we don't know and recognize how to figure out what we don't know in the form of good supervision and in the form of good peer networking, right? Because it's going to be the easiest way instead of just being like, I'm going to spend my Saturdays and Sundays in the journals, which is not helpful for, preventing burnout and having good resources to, rely on. I think as behavior analysts, that's one takeaway that we should have from this book is to build supports to help us be able to mitigate the BS in our jobs. Boom.
All right. Any other final thoughts from folks?
I would like to say that I think the message and information in this book are pretty good. I'm actually not sure that a book was the right vehicle for this information.
A PBS television show?
This could be quite successful as a 3 to 4 part Netflix miniseries.
I would watch it.
I think it could reach a far wider audience than this book ever will. And it's got enough meat to it and interesting stories that it would be a good watch, and you'd still get the main message of it, which is, what they want people to get.
As long as they don't get those the movies that made us or the toys that made us narrator, the way they do documentaries is They just too many edits and ugh.
It's really not the point.
I'm just saying that it would become, ironically, the Calling Bullshit miniseries on Netflix would become bullshit if you used that style of documentary with
you'd have to have the right host.
Lots of editing and visual, like too many visual jokes, joke 'em ups. People.
No, I agree because it's an undergraduate course, so like a TED Talk, or some kind of getting this information and being a little more succinct. Like I think they do drag down in their examples, but maybe that's why they wanted it as a book, because they're like, well, we've got 20 years of notes that we've been accumulating. So, and perhaps by publishing the book, it will make it easier for them to then remain in the field and to then give TED Talks and to go on lecture circuits. So I get why the book could be helpful in that, but the book itself is limited. And I think that we just talked earlier a little bit about audience. I think the page and a half digression of don't actually when you're debunking kind of also points to who the audience for the book is going to be, which is, again, not everybody.
Right.
So it's a very small subset of young potential professionals. Mm-hmm. So
do you think maybe if they'd taken the key points, there are about six key points plus some others related to being online in chapter 10, if they'd taken just those points and rather than let's get into details, the way they sort of segmented up the book, they'd said, question your source of information. Here's a bunch of ways that you want to look at that. If they'd sort of changed so that their kind of final points were just spread throughout the entire book. So like the book itself had 7 chapters, each chapter is, or maybe 8, each chapter is one of the points of how you can spot BS, and it pulls from all of the chapters. Like, would that have made it either more readable, more understandable, more accessible, just been too much information per chapter? I mean, what do you all think? Because I'm kind of wondering if maybe they just said, rather than I'm going to do a whole chapter on the mathiness component, what if I just picked my favorite parts of that and picked the ones that related to question sorts of information or unfair comparisons, probably be most of them, or seems too good or bad. Like I just pull some examples from each of the chapters and put them under those chapter headings. Would it have been more of a almost tutorial book in that regard, easier to understand? Or would it have just been, now we took all the information we spread across 11 chapters and jammed them into, 6 or 7 chapters, which made each chapter harder to read or less coherent?
That's what I would say.
Yeah.
So if you're listening, Bergstrom and West, when you do your nudge version 2 for calling BS, don't use that example. It apparently won't work very well. But again, what's your source? We might make money off of that.
I didn't write this book, so they know more about it than me.
Same.
Yes. So don't listen to our advice because we didn't write a book about skepticism.
Yeah.
Okay. Good call.
Don't take my word for it.
And if you're listening to this, as much as we want you to listen our opinions, be skeptical of our own opinions because they are our opinions only. And if you have not read the book, we try to be objective about what's in the book, but there's a commentary to each of these things. So, whoa. But keep listening, please. Don't assume you should just read the books and never listen to us again. That's what? No. Of course not. You can do both. They're both fun. All right, folks.
Wrapping it up. That's great.
Wrapping it up. Thank you so much to Jackie, Diana, and Alan, our book club crew, for coming together for another discussion of a long, long book, which means a long, long, fun discussion. Couldn't see it. We're all in various places to do this recording because we love talking about books so very, very much. And we want to say thank you so much if you are listening to this on your Patreon feed. Thank you so much again for subscribing. Don't forget, you get a special bonus code word that you can use for a 100% discount to get your CEs for this episode. 2 CEs, no additional charge. Just a big thank you. If you're listening to this way in the future, in the year 2024, I believe, this will come out in the free feed. We also thank you very much for listening. We really appreciate it. We hope you enjoy our book clubs. And if you say there's more than one of these book clubs, where are the rest of them? Well, at this point, we have like 3 years, I think, of book clubs for a year, which you can get either in the free feed or you can go subscribe like so many other folks have subscribed on our Patreon page, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can get access to all of these when they come out. So if you're listening to this right now, there are like 3 book clubs you have not heard. And in addition, you can get CEs for them just for the price of subscribing. It's a lot to listen to, so don't hurt yourself or anything. But as a thank you for subscribing, as well as access to our quarterly live episodes. So that's a lot of CEs you can get just by being a Patreon subscriber with us. So if you are getting this in the free feed, if you're getting this free feed, you might want to check us out, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. And if you're in our regular feed when this came out, we just want to say thank you so much again. Here's that last secret code word. It's George. George. Could be a curious monkey character. Could be a man of the jungle, a humorous cartoon character. It could be the alternate name for Jackie's dog, which is what it is. George. Well, we hope you enjoyed our spring 2023 book club, or at least as the time of recording, on Calling Bullshit by Bergstrom and West. Some mixed opinions on the book, but overall, if you are in the mood for something that goes into skeptical thinking and a review of modern technological driven data, you might enjoy some of this book. If it sounded good to you in listening to our conversation, then I bet you will enjoy reading the book. If it sounded horrible, you probably got all you're going to get out of it from hearing our discussion. But I think the beginning and the end are great. I think everyone else didn't quite like it as much. They sort of agreed at the overall pattern. But give it a try if you like. All right, folks. So our regular episodes will be coming out regularly. But if you are interested in voting on our summer book club, well, if it's still 2023, then you should get over to our Patreon page to vote on that. We're going to be doing a losers bracket, I believe, because Diana really, really wants to pick some of the books that we never chose before. So she gets to read them over the summer. If you are listening to this on the free feed in the future, well, I bet there's a poll coming up pretty soon, so go over the Patreon page anyway. You never know what you're going to find. Chances to vote on lots of things over there. But in any case, thank you for listening to our book club, and keep responding. Bye!